All right. We are so super excited as we play with the technical things in the back. Don't mind the microphone. We are so excited. I can't say this enough, how excited we are to be here today for so many reasons, because today is not just going to be a lecture. Our hope was that it's really going to be a workshop. That's how we felt inspired, and that's how we designed this. So it's not going to be I'm standing up here talking all the time. There will be 3 activities in which you see before you, one of which is a mirror. Then you have a piece of paper that is front and back. And the inspiration from this talk actually came from Joana de Angelis, her whole collection of books, and also from a psychological series that was done in Brazil. An in-depth study really inspired us to do the same here, but in the English language. So what we did was that we are studying, and we are doing an in-depth study of all of her books from a Spiritist psychological perspective. We decided to start out as a backbone of these series of talks. This particular book, The Psychology of Gratitude, we are sold out temporarily here, but we should get some more in the near future. Our talk today will be about the blessing of gratitude, but let us premise that statement by saying a couple of things. Let me explain how today's going to go. First, the things that you have. The mirror will be utilized first, then we will do the writing portions throughout the talk today, or the workshop today. We do ask that when you do write, you do try to think thoroughly about answering the questions. They're questions that are personal for you, so keep it to yourself. It's not meant for you to go and share with other people unless you feel compelled to. For those who are watching on the web or the video series of this, please just email us if you would like a copy sent to you via email of the questions and the workshop series itself. So if we seem a little bit overzealous just because we feel so excited about this whole thing, and it's like Christmas morning and unwrapping a gift, you just feel so privileged, so grateful to be able to do something like this. What's interesting when we study Spiritism is that the more we study, the more we realize that if we're living in the real world and we're reading the newspaper and we're keeping up with modern science, which is a lot of things are published in local news, Yahoo News, CNN, we know that the following statement by Albert Einstein, which is one of the most quoted by him, has to be true and is true. That science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. So the reason why we bring this particular quote is for us to actually remember that psychology is a science. It is a science that came to light, which we'll get into here in a second. We would say way back since the Greek times, there are some notions of ideas of psychology, but it really came to light more so in the 17th century with well-known a French philosopher named René Descartes, as well as in 1879, there was a psychology self-conscious field of experimental study that began in that time by William Wundt, German. So from then on, William James emerged as one of the major American psychologists as well, and so forth and so on. So it actually became a valid science. And that's just over the past century or so. So we are still diving into what all of that means for us. So bridging up what Einstein said to Spiritism, we know the following, that Spiritism and science complete each other. Science without Spiritism is completely unable to explain certain phenomena solely by means of the laws of matter. Spiritism without science would lack support and control. So the type of science we're talking about today is the psychology, of course. But many people don't even know Well, many of us do know that Spiritism, of course, has its three pillars: philosophy, science, religion, right? But perhaps some of us don't really think about that Spiritism actually was born out of the scientific aspect of it. You know, when Kardec began to hear about the turning and talking tables, he began his in-depth scientific study. And from there, we know the rest of all the books that came through over the next couple of decades of his life. So this is sort of a backbone to give some validity to what we're going to discuss today. That psychology has its place, and we respectfully say the following statement that is not necessarily the feelings and beliefs of the SSB, but they are my own, that Joanna de Angelis came to also bring, along with other spirits, to bring more validity to psychology and its need to be in Spiritism, its need for us to look at our emotions, our feelings, and to go more inside. Because we know in these books, in the Spirits book particularly, when they say the question and answer that I'm not coming to mind, but it's the answer that know thyself. How do we get to know ourselves? We are like an onion. We have so many layers. Where do we start? Joanna de Angelis, in many of her books that are already translated in English, help us to start that journey. So here we are, Workshop Series 1, Understanding Ourselves, Our Purpose with Joanna de Angelis, and Spiritism, no less. A couple of the questions that we hope that throughout the next 13 workshop series over the next months to come, that we will begin to individually unravel these questions within us. Who am I? What am I? Where am I going? What have I learned already? Where am I at? What are my shadows, which we'll talk about here in a little bit? What lays beneath the surface of who I am that I have yet to uncover, good and bad? So to start off this series, we want to do an initial assessment. And this is where we'd like all of you to grab the piece of paper that you have, your clipboard. There's 3 questions to start out with that I would like you to answer, which is, for those who are watching over the web, define gratitude, what it means to you as you understand it. It doesn't have to be, and actually try not to write a whole long paragraph, just define gratitude. What does gratitude mean to you? How can I or you practice gratitude or show gratitude? As we are waiting, we're going to play a little bit of a soft music. We're going to give about 4 minutes, but don't worry, think about it. For those of you who are watching on the web or the recorded version of this video, you can take this moment to write down on a piece of paper to define gratitude. What does gratitude mean to me? How can I practice / show gratitude? These answers are also solely for our own self-assessment, just for us to know what we know. Sometimes it's there in our unconscious mind, and when we bring it to light, we're able to understand more profoundly and even add to our own existing understanding of what gratitude is. And we hope that by the end of this talk, you're going to learn a little bit more in depth about what it means to have gratitude and what is the psychology of gratitude. Before I move on here in a minute, I'll give you guys another 30 seconds here. I also wanted to add in here that Joanna de Angelis, who we're going to talk about in just a second, does not propose to bring something new, she says. She simply wants to add, enrich what already exists to bridge up Spiritism and the in-depth understanding of the psychology behind gratitude and many other things. If we don't have time to fully answer all the questions, I really urge you to answer that at home. Think about it, reflect about it. So let's move on. Since we are talking about our dear sister, Joanna DeAngelis, for those of you who are watching on the web, recorded version, or are currently here, it's always good to remind ourselves of who is Joanna DeAngelis. Many of us already know that she is the spirit guide of the Brazilian medium, Divaldo Pereira Franco. But in a video that he published about the many lives of Joanna DeAngelis and getting to know her more, we felt it important for all of us to know who is this great spirit who brought this wealth of knowledge. So after a little bit of research, we came to the following, that per Divaldo Franco, aside from one of her notable lives she lived at the time of Jesus, although he infers that perhaps she was Joanna de Cusa. I didn't put it up here because it was more of an inferred thing. And the same sort of with the story of St. Clare of Assisi. St. Clare of Assisi was Joanna DeAngelis, but let me give you the backstory. Divaldo tells a story like this, that he was traveling in Italy, to Italy, and he found himself in the city called Assisi. He was passing by this particular convent where you actually, until today, can find the well-preserved body of St. Clare. And he said, by chance, he was able to get in there because the convent had been closing for the afternoon, and he managed to get in. And he said when he walked over to, like a lot of people do, because you can see her body well preserved and encased from a gate. It's kind of a little bit far, but he said as he was, but you could still see it close enough, but through pictures, at least for me, you could see the entire body perfectly preserved, the face. And Divaldo said when he walked over to see more closely what St. Clare looked like, he said all of a sudden Joanna appeared before him. And he looked at St. Clare, and he looked at Joanna, and he looked at St. Clare again, he looked at Joanna, and he said in his mind he was thinking, oh, it's the same person, because they looked exactly alike. And Joanna just smiled, and Divaldo said, I understood that that was her. But because Joanna's so humble, she did not want to say that this great spirit was her. We also know that she was Juana Inés de la Cruz, and Juana Inés de la Cruz actually was born in San Miguel, Nepantla, small Mexican town. And long story short, at 17, living in the court, she decided to become a nun and retire to monastic life. And she actually died 30 years later on April 17th, 1695. What she is most notable for is many things. And let me digress and go back a little bit. St. Clare is most famous for starting she's the founder of the Order of the Poor Ladies, and they say she was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. The first time she heard him speak, she felt herself compelled to devote her life. Divaldo says he explained that revelation, that awakening that St. Clare had, was that for many incarnations past, we don't know what she was doing, but it was in this life that she was called back to serve Jesus. And that's why she was so moved by St. Francis. And then she incarnates again as Juana Inés de la Cruz. And our own personal opinion, not those of necessarily of anybody else, but it was in this period, and also St. Clare studied a lot, but Juana Inés de la Cruz was an amazing writer, a poetess, and they even say in one of her writings, at that time in the 1600s, 1700s, up until the 1900s, women writers, you didn't have any validity. You weren't seen as anything special, especially if a man who was a writer read your things. So a man who read her one particular poem she had wrote attacked her in the newspaper. We'll say attack. He had words. She beautifully wrote this long manifesto, and many say that was the first feminine manifesto we know to date. And of course, I could in no way, shape, or form translate this whole big thing because it was not in my native language. But I could see that it was something quite beautiful. So we could say that the Joanna de Angelis we know today, in her immaculate writing, the way in which she's so poetic, we could see over many lifetimes she had been building this. I also believe it was in that lifetime that she had been hiding studying, because at that time, again, girls were not allowed to study, so she would put on men's clothing and try to get books and things of that nature. So now when we always remind this to our children, you know, you think that going to school is nothing. I mean, it truly is a privilege, because in that time, women didn't, unless you were really, really rich or lucky, you didn't really study. So then we find her in 1761 as Joana Angélica de Jesus. Most notably, she was known, well, let me start from the beginning. She was baptized again as Joanna. And again, she opted for religious life as a nun under the name of Joanna, again. And she also happened to die on February 20th, 1822. And Brazilians at that time were fighting for the independence of their country from Portugal. And the most famous story and scene was that when they came to the convent and the other nuns and the priests were fleeing, and in order to buy them some time, she stood in front of the convent like this to stop, and they just killed her with a bayonet. She martyred herself, and which she seems to have that habit of martyring herself. We say that respectfully because she was truly selfless. She truly wanted to help others. And there was even a time, I believe before that, she had tried to martyr herself, but someone had pulled her out. So we see that already from that time, she was since she was St. Clare, was an immensely selfless human being, or soul, if we could say it in that way. And today, we know her as Joanna de Angelis. This is the name when she finally presented herself to Givaldo. And as a matter of fact, she had already been presenting herself to Givaldo, but he didn't know what her name was. And finally, long story short, she presented herself as Joanna de Angelis. So this is this great spirit, this great mind that for many incarnations has been devoting herself to selfless acts, to a lot of charity, and really putting a lot of her time in education. They said that when she was Juana de la Cruz, she was already studying great thinkers, great minds, theology, astronomy, really diving into. So that's just for us to get a glimpse of who we are dealing with here. Another great mind who we will be referring to quite a bit throughout this series is Carl Gustav Jung. Many of us know who he is, but he was born July 26, 1875 in Switzerland and died in 61. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychotherapist who founded analytical psychology. What is very interesting about Carl Gustav Jung is that his father and many members of his family were clergymen. His uncle was, his grandfather was, his father was, so it was expected that he would be a clergyman. But he very early on, he knew he did not want to be a clergyman, but he wanted to study. So he went to university, he studied, and his idea was to become a medical doctor, but he didn't know what area, what he wanted to do. He himself tells a story of when he decided to study psychiatry. And soon after this particular, we would say, spiritual incident / mediumistic incident, he continued to have these types of experiences. He tells the story that he's walking home from the university, and he says like this: I was walking home, and all of a sudden, I had this intense moment of clarity where I could see myself, but then I could also see myself as a young man, and I saw an old man. And he said for some reason after that, he felt like he wanted to understand what that was. Was it his mind? Was it his thoughts? So from then on, that catapulted him. It was sort of his walk to Damascus, if you will. As Paul had his moment, Jung has had his moment, and that was his defining moment. That was the pivotal thing for him. He also proposed and developed concepts of the extroverted and introverted personality archetypes in the collective unconscious. We're going to define what all that means, because although we do not need to become psychologists or psychiatrists to understand Joanna, it's nice to know what these words mean when she uses them in the books, and not just this book, but many of her books. She derives these mainly from Jung. A lot of his archetypes, she mentions them, and they're going to be mentioned throughout our talk today and moving forward. Carl Jung also is one of the most important, most complex, most controversial psychological theorists. Jungian psychology focused on establishing and fostering the relationship between conscious and unconscious processes. The dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious aspects of the psyche enriches the person, and Jung believed that without this dialogue, unconscious processes can weaken and even jeopardize the personality. Over and over again, a lot of his biographies say that because of his personal experiences that he had, he wanted to understand what was happening to him. Today, day and age, he might have gone to see a psychic, he might have come to a spiritist center, who knows? Or who knows what, at that time, he already was alive at the time when the turning tables were big in Europe. So we would like to think to some degree, he probably was looking at some of that. I put all the resources down here at the bottom. If anybody, they are free, they are online, and you can either purchase them or get them yourself. This is an excerpt from Personality and Personal Growth by this particular author who writes about Carl Gustav Jung. So bridging together Jung, Joanna, and Spiritism, we wanted to talk about how Joanna starts this book. Before we actually go on, we wanted to remind our viewers and our friends here today that, again, this will be a workshop. And because of that, sometimes it can go a little bit longer than usual. So one of the things we are utilizing to combat that is we gifted you some little candies. So if you feel a little bit like you need a little boost of energy, you can get up, feel free to walk a bit or stand up, or just, you can eat your lolly. So one of the ways in which Joanna starts out this particular book in the introduction is she talks about archetypes. We're going to define here in a second what archetypes are. But what's interesting is that she says that it's utilized to help us to understand what is going on with man. She talks about Greek mythology. She tells some stories in here about Greek mythology, about Perseus. If anybody knows, I don't want to go too much into it because that's not the purpose of my talk today, the Greek myth about Perseus and all that happens with him. And she utilizes him because Perseus overcomes all of these inner demons. So she says that these archetypes she uses, and many people use throughout history, to help us to understand life, what goes on around us. We already talked a little bit about Jung, but Jung also believed that archetypes are models of people, behaviors, or personalities. They are models of people, behaviors, or personalities. Jung also suggested that the psyche was composed of 3 components. We ask that you remember what these are because they will be mentioned throughout this workshop and the 13 to come. The ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Joanna uses this terminology throughout her books. And in this particular book, she most definitely uses this. So it would behoove us to know a little bit about this. So according to Jung, the ego represents the conscious mind, while the personal unconscious contains memories, including those that have been suppressed, and the collective unconscious, per Jung, is a unique component. And in this part of the psyche, it's served as a form of psychological inheritance. It contains all the knowledge and experiences we share as a species, per Jung. Now, Joanna, in this particular quote, she says that, and this is the opening of the book, allegories have always been a part of the collective unconscious. And remember, the collective unconscious, per Jung, is a unique component, and it's a part of the psyche served as a form of psychological inheritance. It contains all the knowledge and experiences we share as a species, Jung believed. We're going to dive into that a little bit. Again, Joanna says, allegories have always been a part of the collective unconscious of society during the difficult times in history. It was through them, as well as fairy tales and folklore, that it became possible to present logical explanations for the complexities in life. So, we see here that she's giving validity to this collective unconscious. The only difference is that Jung, to the best of our knowledge, he never printed anything to the effect of that he believed exclusively in reincarnation. Here and there it might be inferred, but not explicitly. But we know that in Spiritism, through our many incarnations, we keep that inherited knowledge we keep with us. What's also interesting, if you read the Spirits book, the Spirits say that in terms of societies, because we have different cultures, different societies, we are born into the society in which we have the most affinity for. So when people say, for instance, oh, this society, oh, all the people there are highly intellectual, they're so obsessed with that. In this society, they're all about hugging and love and all this stuff. You know, is it by chance? No, it's not by chance. It's not. Not according to the Spiritist thought, that we reincarnate into societies that we have affinity with and in that which we need to learn. So, in terms of the collective unconscious, that makes sense. It makes sense. And it makes sense that we use these allegories. You know, we have Plato's allegory of the cave to explain how man awakens, develops and grows and comes out of his ignorance, comes out of his shadows. So Joanna's going to also utilize Jung's archetypes throughout her discussion. What we propose to do here today is to really give a backbone of the psychology of which the psychology that she uses for all of her books, at least in part, because time's not permitting to really go more into depth. That's why we're going to have a number of workshops. But today we really wanted to dive into understanding this. So we urge you to write these terms down, even go home, maybe look it over, read it over. So when we're studying the psychology of gratitude, we truly are understanding the in-depth understanding of all that. And we went into the collective unconsciousness and reincarnation. So when I am born into a certain society and we bring with us back the same understanding, the same knowledge, so we remember. So if I'm continuously reincarnating in this particular country, I'm going to feel comfortable. There are certain people that are born in different countries and don't feel like that they belong there. We've had the personal experience of knowing many people that were born in a different country and have said since they were a child, they felt like they didn't belong there. They belonged, let's say, for instance, in the US. And that they'd always told their parents that, like, I don't belong here. So it's interesting because this unconscious memory does exist. But let's understand what are archetypes a little bit more profoundly. It comes from the Greek archetype tupon. It means something molded first as a model. And from the Latin arche, meaning primitive, and tupos, meaning a model. So it basically is a model of something for us to understand. Psychology is all about utilizing things to help us understand other things, right? Are we all grasping so far some of the terminology? It is a lot. We recognize that. That's why we have a piece of paper in front of us to write down things and also to ask questions later. But we will open up a time if you all want to ask questions or have a comment. We can open for that as well. But we wanted to talk about how psychology meets Spiritism and Joanna de Angelis. Something we wanted to talk about, some of the archetypes. Just looking for my little, here we go. Some of the archetypes, 5 most notable ones that we're going to talk about because Joanna uses them, are these here. And these are in the exact order. So here we are, let's just say this whole picture is us. We have the level of the consciousness and the unconscious part of us. The outermost layer is the one we show the most, which is called the persona. The persona is how we present ourselves to the world. And the word persona is derived from a Latin word that literally means mask. It's not a literal mask, however. So for instance, if I'm a teacher, I go to work, my persona is a teacher. I act a certain way, I try to be professional, but when I go home and I put my slippers on, put my robe on, and turn on Netflix, I'm no longer a teacher, I'm just me, looking at Netflix or interacting with my daughter or my neighbors or my spouse or whatever. So we have different personas. If I'm a banker, I'm at the bank, I'm dealing with people. But when I go home, I'm laughing, I'm making jokes, because perhaps maybe, in a professional setting, we can't be that way. So personas are not necessarily bad, but they can be, and we'll talk about that. Then we have the ego, the most part of us that is often seen as really bad. And let us dispel that misconception. The ego is not bad per se. It is the center of consciousness. It is identity. It is I, but is not the totality of the psyche. The problem with the ego is when the ego and the persona get together and have a party all day long, and they never go beneath the surface. That's the problem. If the ego is connecting more with the self, which we'll get into here, it's good. It's wanting to go deeper. It's wanting to understand. So the ego is not bad. But when people say, oh, he's so egocentric, yes, that can be bad. When you're only thinking of yourself and you're only being materialistic, that can be bad. But the ego in and of itself, it's not bad. Your poor ego, be nice to it. It is part of who you are. Now, okay, if I had the ability to have those blinking lights and have people come out and do a special dance, this is some of the really important stuff. This is some of the stuff we don't really hear about. We hear people talk about the persona and the ego, but very few do we hear this term shadow. Shadow, this is important to know this aspect. It consists of the sex and life instincts. The shadow exists as part of the unconscious mind and is composed of repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings. Some of the most important parts of the shadow, or rather for us to know, is that this can be a serious problem. Because here I am having my persona and I'm, la-di-da with my ego. This shadow here is where all my repressed issues, they're all there beneath the surface. And some of us don't deal with it very well. Let's give an example. We view ourselves as a nice person. I'm pretty calm. I'm pretty chill. But for whatever reason, I'm driving down the road and somebody cuts me off and I become a different person. I start to chase after them. I become enraged. Has anything ever happened to any of us like that? Where you thought you were one way and then something out of the blue happens and you become a different person? And then you calm down again and you're not that person. Has that ever happened to anybody? I don't have to know what it is. It could be good or bad, actually. Because this also can mean something, you're living your life normally and then all of a sudden you surprise yourself by doing something really good. And you're like, oh, I didn't even know I could be capable of that. A good example of that is sometimes artistic talent, musical talent, the ability to listen really well to someone or give good advice. Sometimes someone comes to you and says, hey, Joanna, I need some advice. What do I do? And you give advice and you realize, the person says, oh, that was really good. And then you surprise yourself. That could be something in the shadows of who we are, in our psyche. This exists for every single person. This is what we wish to uncover. This. So we're going to stop here for a second. I want each of you to get out your mirror that I have given you. Leo, there's a mirror right there. I think it's on the floor. One extra one. No? You don't want to break it. It's interesting that many of us don't even have the habit of looking in the mirror. even today when we were bringing the mirrors, I won't say who it was, but someone was like, oh, I don't even look in mirrors. And then it reminded me of myself because I thought, oh, that's so true about me too, because for so many years I hated looking in the mirror. It became so much of a habit that it became unconscious. I just avoided mirrors and I took the mirror out of my bedroom. But we should look at ourselves, get into the habit, look at ourselves and saying something positive. And begin to uncover these shadows. So the mirror is just symbolic. But I would like everyone to get the mirror in their hand, to look at yourself, and you can say in your mind, not out loud, today is the first day of many days ahead where I will begin to unravel who I really am, good and bad, but I will face it with faith, with hope, with gratitude. Now, look at yourself again. Keep looking at yourself. And in your mind, I want you to say, I love you. You're good. Despite some things that are hidden beneath the shadow that I don't yet know about, but you're good. Stop thinking about the little flaws on your face and look at the beauty, the blessing. I love myself. I am a child of God. I'm pretty handsome. I'm pretty. You can put your mirrors down. They are for you. Do ask that you bring it to every workshop. If you think you might forget it, you can leave it here. But this will be the first of many exercises. I encourage you to do this at home. Even Divaldo Franco says he had to get into the habit of looking at himself in the mirror and saying, I love you. You are great. We need to build up ourself, work on our self-love. Because as we begin to unravel this unconscious part of ourself, we need to be strong for the good and the not so good. The other part that lays beneath the shadow, these are all layers. It's your persona, then your ego, then the shadows, then the anima and animus. What's interesting about the anima and animus is that the anima is a feminine image of the male psyche. The anima is a feminine image in the male psyche, and the animus is a male image in the female psyche. For instance, we take Leo, right? Leo will have an anima within him, and let's just say Alba has an animus inside of her. So what does that mean? It's the opposite. So if I'm female, it's the male aspect, or the male aspect of us. So as a woman, we tend to be very emotional, subjective, and males, not always, stereotypically, right, can be more objective, straight to the point. Now, many women can say, well, I'm pretty straight to the point, I'm pretty objective. That's good. It means that you're probably more in touch with this anima side within you. What's interesting is that Jung and Joanna say that what happens sometimes with us, she says that a majority of people, for many incarnations, never pass this point, never go below the shadows. Because that part of us stays dormant, whether because we're too scared or we spend too much time here in the persona, in the ego, spending so much time with because the persona is how I'm projecting to everybody around me. You know, a lot of people say, we're going to give our own personal experience of this. People say, oh, makeup is not good. That's so, materialistic. Wearing nice clothes, name brand stuff, that's so materialistic. It depends. If we are so stuck here and we never go beneath here, yes. Because if we're stuck here, we never grow. This is here what stunts us. What lays beneath the surface, our weaknesses, our shortcomings. Sometimes we're so scared, fearful to know what lays beneath. This happens a lot with traumas. We would use the example that is most concrete for us, sexual abuse. A lot of people suppress that because when they were a child, and it just gets suppressed because they don't wish to remember it because it's so traumatic. But for as long as that's there, it's difficult for that person to grow. That's why it's really important for people that experience traumas to get help, psychological help, to deal with that. And one of the things that they, Spiritism says, and also Jung says, to make sure when you're, when you're going for help, it is hopefully with a licensed specialist. Spiritism is not a religion or a belief system that says, oh, you don't need a therapist. We believe that medical professionals are very much necessary and actually really good for us, independent if we've had a trauma or not. People who suffer from things like PTSD, that trauma, they're unable to move forward because it's a constant thing laying beneath that surface. But thank God, there are a lot of new therapies that are coming out about that. So anima and animus. So these are 5 archetypes that Jung named. There are many others, but these are there's one more I'm going to name, but these are some of the main ones. The last one is the self. The self basically is the unification of unconsciousness, and consciousness. Are we following with all this? We're good with all this? Again, Joanna mentions all of these archetypes in this book. In the very first sentence, she mentions it, collective unconsciousness. So it behooves us to understand these. So let's remember these. We can write them down. Our next session, I will have a printout just for us to refer back to in our further workshops for us to understand. Joanna adds to this archetypes. She brings a spiritist perspective to light as we go moving forward. She says, the conquest of consciousness, which is the reality of what's going on with us now, is thus a very sore delivery of the unconscious, which continues to hold a significant portion of psychic contents that the ego needs and should assimilate. Let's go back. She's talking about this, consciousness, okay? The conquest of consciousness is a very sore delivery of the unconscious. So what she's saying here is, what lies beneath here is going to come up. It's a delivery of all that's in black here, this is the unconsciousness, our memories, that which we want to suppress, our shortcomings, our instincts, parts of us that we don't even want to accept that is us, but it's there. From previous lives, from past tendencies, it's there. But what she's saying is that the conquest of consciousness, conquering it, that a very sore delivery of the unconscious, which continues to hold a significant portion of the psychic contents that the ego needs and should assimilate. So who I am, the ego, my identity, I need to begin to assimilate it, understand it, grow from it. She defines the ego, and I'm sorry, I think you all can see where this is from. It's in a book that's not yet in English. It's called Triunfo Pessoal, which I think translate would be Personal Triumph. It's a very good book. I recommend it if you can read Portuguese. I think it's in Spanish as well. She defines the ego. She states about the ego the following. She says, slowly the ego has been developing and has become a key element in the survival of awareness of the human being, rooting itself in the psyche and externalizing itself in the personality, where it continues to develop. So here we are this. Through many incarnations, many lifetimes. Currently, I am Leonardo Vieira. I'm a banker, I'm a father. Sorry, Leo, I'm using you. I'm all these things. That is my persona. But what I am underneath is things that maybe I myself don't even know. They're not even my mother and closest friends yet know. And that's normal for all of us. It's not a bad thing at all. It means we got our work cut out for us. We have a lot of things yet we have to do and accomplish. Along the lines of this consciousness, conquering it, as Joanna says, with the help of our ego assimilating it, Jung says the following: our consciousness does not create itself. It wells up from unknown depths, but we know this unknown depths is through many incarnations. In childhood, it awakens gradually, and all through life, it wakes each morning out of the depths of sleep from an unconscious condition. It is not only influenced by the unconscious, but continually emerges out of it in the form of spontaneous ideas and sudden flashes of thought. Let me give you an example, and this is in this particular publication. This story is someone else's story that we heard during studying the psychological series of Joanna DeAngelis, where this gentleman tells a story. We shared it here this Thursday. For those of you who weren't here, I'm going to share it again. There is a woman let's just say, at my job, and we refer to her as the nun because she's always so quiet, so calm all the time. She's just nun-like in nature. If you can imagine what a nun is, very, you know what it is. So one day she comes in very disheveled, very looking like a little bit crazy, like, what's going on with you? So we approached her and said, in a kind-hearted manner, and said, hey, nun, what's going on with you? And she proceeded to say that when she was traveling to work, she was accosted by a robber with a knife in his hand. And normally she's a calm person, nun-like, that she grabbed the knife, threw it down, and told the guy to get out of here. And she was so shocked, more by her own reaction than even by the being accosted by the thief. She was more shocked at herself. That's what she said. I'm so shocked that I had that impulse, that instinct to react like that I'm so disturbed by it. So that is what Jung is talking about here when he says, from the unconscious mind emerges spontaneous ideas and sudden flashes of thought. We can see this in our children. When our children begin to manifest tendencies, good and bad, that we need to help mold them to fix. That's why even Maria Montessori, the great Italian educator, said that educating our child begins in the womb. But really, as we're watching the child grow, we should be paying attention to their tendencies. I know our kids probably complain like, oh, you're always correcting me all the time. Well, we see the tendencies of our kids. If they have a tendency to do this or that, it's important because it is a part of either their shadows. Joanna adds to this by saying the following. In the book, Self-Discovery, she says, the blossoming of consciousness is a slow and continuous work, which is the challenge of the process of evolution. Subscribing to God's laws in your heart, developing from within the concentrated effort of will as an essential goal of life. God's laws, at least some of them, 10, we can read about those laws, divine laws, in part 3 of the Spirit's book. Physical laws are also God's laws because He created everything. But some of the moral laws we can find here in part 3 of the Spirit's book. We truly guarantee you, we can give you a true guarantee, an SSB guarantee. If you study part 3 of the Spirit's book, it will change you. It will change you. If you truly go home and do your personal study, begin to read it week by week, 3 questions once a week, it will change you. It will help the blossoming of your consciousness because it will go. What it will do is the following. It's going to bring to light these shadows. You're going to begin to think about things about yourself. Because the problem, or we should say, the thing about the shadows is not that we're going to uncover something bad. That's not a problem. The good news about the shadow part of ourself is that we need only find it. Acknowledge that it's there. Recently, a friend of ours, let me go back a little bit further. Recently, Daniel, on a recent Monday, gave a mini talk about permanent tolerance. It's a message in the book Living and Loving by Joanna DeAngelis. And one of our friends who was really, truly meditating on permanent tolerance, she texted us and said, Kirsten, I did not have permanent tolerance today. Somebody cut me off on the highway, and I had some words for them and some gestures of my hands. And she said, I was not tolerant. But after that moment passed, I was very upset with myself, and I said, well, I guess you didn't hear anything that Daniel said. I guess you're just a terrible person. I said, no, don't say that. You are uncovering who you are. That is part of the dilemma. Sometimes we're so blind to it. At least we can acknowledge it. I can say to myself, I have road rage. So when I drive, be conscientious of it. So I say, okay, constantly bringing to my consciousness, okay, I know that I can get potentially irritated as I'm driving. So, okay, someone cuts me off again, because people always cut everybody off in the highway for some reason. Because we should think the following. We should say, that person, maybe they're rushing to see a loved one that's dying. Maybe they have to use the bathroom really bad. Maybe they're late for work. Maybe they're just running through life and not even realizing what's going on around them. So God bless them. May they awaken and may they be safe. Instead of giving them a few choice words, it's an opportunity for us to grow, become aware. So again, it's not bad to identify that you have this or that within you. It's just to identify, to become aware of it, to know that I need to work on it. Do you remember I asked you in the beginning of our session to define gratitude? I want you all to look at your answers at this time. Take a minute, look at what you wrote. Okay. We're going to define gratitude from the perspective of Joanna DeAngelis and through Spiritism, and really from its true definition. Gratitude from the Latin gratia, which means grace, or from gratis, which means pleasing. It means the pleasing acknowledgement for everything that is received or bestowed upon us. This is Joanna's definition. The pleasing acknowledgement for everything that is received and bestowed upon us. Does anybody perceive something? It took us a couple of times before we could pick this up. She doesn't say for everything positive, for everything good. She says the pleasing acknowledgement for everything that is received or bestowed upon us. That's a controversial statement for some people. Because then someone could say, well, Kirsten, are you saying that I should be grateful for the guy that punched me in my face? Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm saying. Well, that's exactly what she's saying. And we'll unravel why she's saying that. Because everything in life is about learning. Everything. One day we will get to the point where St. Francis did. What's it, St. Francis? When they burned his cataracts? Yes. He was blessing the iron that had to burn his eyes. That's what she's talking about. Blessing the thing that was potentially causing him the greatest pain. He blessed that. We could probably say, no, I'm not there yet. Not there yet. But let's acknowledge that. Okay, I'm not there yet. That's okay. I'm going to get there one day. That's okay too. But let's acknowledge what we are to ourselves. You don't have to go out saying, hey, Alba, I'm a bad person. No, we're not. That's not what we're saying here. Within yourself, when you look at yourself in the mirror and say, I have some shortcomings here, my friend, but we're going to work this out together. You and me in this mirror, we're going to work this out. We're going to do this. Joanna says some of the opposing forces of gratitude is the ego. And I'll explain why. Earlier I said the ego is not the enemy. Let's explain this. Joanna says the ego is built from fecundation, which is the moment of impregnation, until the adult phase, without the awareness of what is being offered. Brings us to responsible for building the ego. From the time that a woman is impregnated until the adult phase, that period is the period of time that the ego is built. So every single lifetime during that period is when the ego is being built. My identity of who I am is being built. What's interesting is that people might say that, well, people get caught up in what they think they're supposed to be. For instance, when we are a woman, sometimes we are brought up to believe, or we live in a family that says, well, you must grow up and get married. I had an interesting conversation with a teenager recently, and she was saying to me, oh, I want to get married. I can't wait to get married. And I said to her, Why? And she looked at me puzzled like, what do you mean why? Everybody gets married. I said, no, not everybody gets married. There's a large percentage of people nowadays that don't get married. I said, why do you think you want to get married? And she's like, oh, I don't know. I just think that's what people do. So it's interesting. So this young child's ego, her identity, has been built probably for many lifetimes, probably in that current existence, maybe social media. You know, nowadays, I particularly, although I love Disney, nowadays they're better, but they really gear towards the women finding a man and living happily ever after, which I always felt like so unrealistic. I think they should stop doing that. You know, when are they going to have a Disney movie where it's the woman living on her own and just living like that, and that's going to be her happily ever after? No, seriously. I mean, these are things that are building up our children's ideas. Now, don't get me wrong. Cinderella is wonderful. It's great. And in that story are many archetypes that many women have that were built because of those ideas, constantly waiting for a man to come and save them, or a man who feels like he has to save a woman. These are many archetypes that we are fed over many incarnations and that impede our progress because we don't no longer fit into molds. I think it was Leo that was mentioning recently, or was it Daniel, that the Syrian war and things that are going on, a lot of people are immigrating, I don't know the word, immigrating, okay, to Sweden, Germany. And their ideas of women are very progressive. So these people who have Germany, yeah. These people that are coming from this different country where women are just things, in Germany, a woman, you can be president. So they're having a conflict of like, whoa, there's something different. Cultural difference, which is good because we have to grow, we need to change these old ideas. So the ego, by Joanna's definition, also says, ego becomes more aware when judgment arises from the personality and, quote, calls upon it for personal contribution. Leo, can you read this thing for me again out loud?
Ego becomes more aware when judgment arises from the personality and calls upon it for personal contribution.
I want us to look at this and think about it for a moment. And think, does this remind you of anything that you've ever read anywhere else? What she's saying here is that once the ego is formulated from the time of fecundation till the adult phase, the ego, I, become more self-aware when the judgment from my personality, when I begin to judge myself, that's when I begin to awaken. Does this sound familiar, like anything else you've ever read in Spiritism? It's not a trick question. I'm not trying to make you guys feel like, you know. This, when we read in the Spirit's book that the laws of God are written in our conscience, this is what it is. When we begin to judge ourselves, when we know that when I do something that's bad, and then I get this kickback from myself, and I say, oh, that wasn't good. That's the laws of God speaking to us, saying, that wasn't the best choice, Joanne. You shouldn't have done that. I don't know who Joanne is, just a name that came to me randomly. So I'm not talking about anybody in particular, it's just a random name. So this is what can exist for all of us, independent of religion, age. Laws of God are written in everybody's conscience. But the one thing that Jung says, and Joanna says, that sometimes that part of us that lays beneath the shadows, that unconsciousness, stays dormant for a long time. That's why we see many cold-hearted people, because that unconscious part, that part of them that they should be developing, the self, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is dormant. And until they awaken, because it's not that they're not listening to the laws of God, it's just so quiet within them. Their persona and their ego speaks much louder. But Joanna in this book gives us a perfect example of what gratitude looks like in the flesh. St. Francis of Assisi. He is most notable for, again, blessing things that hurt him, blessing the moon, blessing the sun, blessing all things. We talk about here legitimate gratitude. Joanna says that it demands that individuals be possessed of this inner sentiment of enchantment for life, this sweet rapture. She's describing here what legitimate gratitude is. Demands that individuals be possessed of this inner sentiment of enchantment for life, the sweet rapture that makes life precious under any condition by which it manifests, so that they may understand the magic of existence in realizing the gifts that multiply in countless expressions of exchange. This is the proposal for humanity. We could probably say we aren't there yet in its entirety, to be enchanted with life, to be enchanted with everything. Someone trips you on the highway. God bless you, my friend, thank you. When somebody cuts you off in the highway, bless you, my friend, God bless you. But this is a proposal. So I want us to take a second to think about what it means, what I would look like, how I would act if I had enchantment for life, if I had a sweet rapture that makes life precious under any condition, which means no matter what I'm going through, lost my job, got a new job, lost my best friend, father died, anything. What would it look like if I could have this enchantment for life, the appreciation? She really uses this term, the magic of existence, because truly when we read about St. Francis, it seems like he's a Disney character. Everything is magical to him. Life is beautiful. Everything is sweet, because he was the embodiment of gratitude. Everything that he did, everything that he experienced, good and bad, he blessed it. This is the part of the psychological framework we need to reach to fully embody that. When we understand gratitude, these are just some components, some aspects that Joanna says. The gratitude, when we are grateful, it has a psychotherapeutic aspect. It shows when we are grateful that we have reached psychological maturity. She calls it the noblest sentiment. And it's achieved by reasoning, which is interesting. By reasoning. Which means we have to break through that unconscious part of ourselves, reason. And she says, all who truly understand real gratitude enjoy physical, emotional, and psychological health. They are content in sharing all things. She calls it the noble sentiment, and she says, noble sentiment, deeper and more significant sentiment, because it is not limited to the casual reward mechanism. On the contrary, it is grander for the satisfaction it brings and for the psychotherapeutic character. And we're about to get a little bit more in depth into what gratitude means and defining it, because for many of us, we often think about gratitude, or perhaps we don't. We think about when we do good for somebody else and they're ungrateful. Oh, I did this for this person, but they didn't appreciate it. We're not understanding. Joanna says that when we feel like that, we are yet spiritually immature. We haven't grasped yet this understanding of truly just giving and being grateful to give. She says the following. When the process of emotional growth, we're going to have to get back some of those definitions. When the process of emotional growth frees the spirit from the shadows that had confounded it until then, it brings forth the light of truth, which is the understanding of the significant values that integrate the individual to the harmonious concert of the cosmos. Hinita, can you read that again for me? Oh, hold on.
When the process of emotional growth frees the spirit from the shadows that had confounded it until then, it brings forth the light of truth, which is the understanding of the significant values that integrate the individual to the harmonious concert of the cosmos. Joanna De Angelis.
Thank you. This is why understanding our emotional life is so important for us to identify what our emotions are, what our feelings are, because she says, when the process of emotional growth frees the spirit from the shadows. Remember, do we remember what the shadows are? What are the shadows? The hidden parts of us, yes. The deep unconscious parts of us, generally that aren't necessarily good things, but they can be. Repressed, yes, thank you, Alba. So she says, when the process of emotional growth frees us from our shadows that had confounded it, meaning that had been holding it back, it brings forth the light of truth, which is the understanding of the significant values that integrate the individual to the harmonious concert of the cosmos. We begin to really flourish and blossom. And she says here, the immature self suffers from the dominating ego. It incorporates merits it does not have. They hoard goods in their closets, desire to be respected, fear before being loved. They don't know how to love. That's why they do that. It generates insecurities, social vices such as the use of alcoholic beverages, drug abuse, tobacco, meaningless sex. And she says that these people tend to have this defensive, aggressive posture. So we're not saying that these people are bad. We might identify ourselves somehow in there, here and there, having some insecurities. But again, identifying these shadows within us, as cliche as it's about to sound, but the first step is acknowledging what is there in order to overcome it. So we have to ask ourselves, are we doing these things? Am I focusing on the material? Am I being fearful of things? Working on the shadows, really diving deep within myself and begin to ask the scarier questions, which we're going to do now. Look again to this second part of your piece of paper. For those of you who are watching on the web or the recorded version, you can just read what's on the screen. The question is, when Joanna refers to, quote, shadows, and Jung, those things we hide deep down within us, in regards to this archetype, what shadows do you think are keeping you from expressing true gratitude, or are stopping you from moving on in life? And as a reminder from Carl Gustav Jung, the shadow exists as a part of the unconscious mind and is composed of repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings. But again, they also can be positive things that we aren't remembering in this life that we have been before.
Can you give us 5 years instead of 5 years?
So this, I was asking for 5 years to answer this. What is the good thing about this? We are hoping that we will begin to ask ourselves more of this question. Ask ourselves, what am I not seeing in myself? Jung, along with Joanna, often say that if we're not sure what the shadows are, if we sincerely think, feel, Kirsten, I don't know, then we have an easy answer for you. Pay attention throughout your day and your weeks when you're interacting with other people. And take note of every time somebody really irritates you. Take note of it. And just say, okay, today, Megan from the IT department really made my blood boil because she did X, Y, and Z. Take note of it. Begin taking note of everybody that bothers you. Jung, again along with Joanna, says most of the time when something in somebody else bothers you, it's because you have something inside of yourself that's being activated. So because there are certain things people do that don't bother you, but it bothers my neighbor. And we can have this conversation with our friends, and you and your friend could have the same experience and say, man, that really bothered me. And I could say, really? I was unaffected by it. So that says something about the psyche. That says something about us that we need to be more aware of. Jung says we should simply question it. Ask ourselves, why does that bother me? Do I have something within me? Am I scared of something? Am I afraid? It's something a friend of mine said to me recently. She was in a very important meeting amongst high-level executives, and one of her colleagues, who she's friends with outside of work is high up in the company, and turned to her because the boss had said, oh, I need you to create this Excel spreadsheet and do this, this, and this. And she was like, oh, I'm not sure how to do it. And her colleague turned to her and was like, how do you not know? It said all these things to her. And she said she got so angry, first because she said it in front of everybody. And then she said she felt so embarrassed. So she was venting to me about this and saying, I felt so stupid. I have a degree and everything, but I felt so stupid. And then we were talking about it. And I said, well, you don't use Excel spreadsheet. We don't use Excel spreadsheet. I don't think you're supposed to know it. But, according to this colleague of hers, she was. So she went and talked to this friend, and the friend explained that she had no malice in her heart. It just was her reaction. She didn't mean to embarrass her at all. And matter of fact, she went on to show her exactly how to do it and said, look, if you ever want me to explain to you, how to work in Excel, because she's like the whiz at work with that. So it warrants us, and this particular friend who told me this recognized within herself that she felt insecure, that she actually wanted to learn more, to feel more secure, to feel more useful in her work and what she does. So let us take note of the things. If we can spend just one more minute, if you could think of, even just write down something. What do you think? Because sometimes even these shadows, we know a little bit. Like a little bubble pops up sometimes and we push it back down again because we don't want to deal with it. And this activity is also meant for us to go home and really reflect about it. And as we proceed on with more of these series of workshops, for us to really go in deeper within ourselves to think about these things. Joanna, in this book, The Psychology of Gratitude, for those of you who want to read this particular pages 13 through 18, she talks about what real gratitude is. And we're going to discuss this here in just 10 more seconds, and then we're going to move on from your writing. And I urge you can go home and write down. Journaling is very therapeutic. Very therapeutic. It helps us to see on paper things that we don't necessarily are able to process on our own. That's why therapists are also really good as well. Okay. Let's stop where you are, and we encourage you, like I said, to write more at home, think about it, journal about it, to discover more about who we are and our potential. Joanna, in this book, we're going to define real gratitude. We talked a little bit about when we mentioned St. Francis, and I want you to think about the definitions you wrote about what real gratitude is. And she says the following: gratitude, it's an inner state, and it imitates the gifts of bliss and peace. She says, it is for this reason that those who thank the good they spread with a smile or a word, a facial expression in silence, or prayer and chant, are always happy and live fully. But she says there is a misconception of gratitude. She says the following: those who always expect to receive or await the congratulatory answer after the fulfillment of any activity, or who promote the execution of noble acts but count on the recognition of others, they all negotiate at an immature state and remain unstable, neurasthenic, and restless. What does this mean here? She says for people who do good and believe that they should be thanked for it, are still, what's that? Right, to be recognized, are still in this immature state. We're not saying that they're bad people, not by a long shot. We already learned today that consciousness is a conquest over time, as Joanna says. But again, to recognize where we are. When we do good, and this is a question we need to ask ourselves, when we do good, even at an unconscious level, does some part of me, would I like to be thanked? Most of us, yes, to some degree. You want some sort of acknowledgement, even to know if you should proceed doing that. So there's some sort of, like, was that good? Did I do good? Well, within ourselves, we know when we did good. We know when I did something good. You help somebody out, even if they don't say anything. You let somebody who asks you to get in the lane, you let them go, and they don't do that whole hand thing. It's okay. You let them go. You did something good. She says, when we are truly grateful, we never experience any type of deception or complaint because there's no expectation of what is accomplished. This we can ask ourselves. Do I feel deceived or do I complain when I do something good and nobody recognizes it, nobody acknowledges it? How many good things we've done in our life and in your family, at work, people don't acknowledge it. We don't need them to. To do good, to be good, we should be. And once we reach this true spiritual maturity, we'll reach that level. We can do good without any expectation. She says the search for self-realization is therefore achieved from the moment that gratitude exerts its predominance on the self without any disturbing shadows, at which point it becomes a blessing from God. Remember we talked about those archetypes, the persona, the ego, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the self. Jung says, as Abraham Maslow has his own understanding of psychology, what Maslow calls self-actualization, Jung says selfhood, meaning the conquest of all of my darkness and the anima or animus within me, meaning Jesus was a perfect example of this anima and animus within us. He knew how to be feminine yet masculine. He had the perfect embodiment of everything. But until we reach down those levels, this fullness of the self can't be reached yet. Overcoming. In the book, Existential Conflicts, it's really good also, teaches about our emotions, going deep down within our shadows, uncovering them, dealing with them. Because truly, Joanna says this, Joanna DeAngelis, modern day psychology, in order for us to progress on, we need to deal with our inner conflicts, our inner demons. We need to face them. You don't have to face them today because God gives us free will. You don't have to. But sooner or later, we have to. We all will face that which we wish to hide. But besides, as Joanna says, it bubbles to the surface now and again. Sometimes people misdiagnose, especially in the Spiritist community, we misdiagnose each other and say, oh, that person's obsessed. They have a spiritual disturbancy. When Joe comes in to the center and flips out all of a sudden, we think, oh, it's an obsession. It's really probably not. It's just that unconscious part of him that he hides most of the time when he seems like he's cool and collective and with it, and then he has these outbursts. It's a part of him that could be a spiritual disturbance, of course. The spiritual component is always there. But it is something within him that he needs to acknowledge and work on. And the best thing we can do when we see that is to bless them, not to make it worse and add to it and talk bad about Joe. Poor Joe, he needs prayers. There's nobody here named Joe, just for record on, well, you don't count. There's nobody named here Joe, really. No American truly named. So, this is not about anybody particular. We bless you, Joe, whoever you are. Anyway, as some take-home thoughts, because today is a workshop, it's going to be a series of workshops. We're not going to really do take-home tips per se, but some final ideas for us to think about, for us to go home about. When Joanna talks about gratitude, she says it's more than just, what do they call that? Talking about it. It's beyond simple speech. It is one's acts that should be considered as resources for human dignification. It is in what we do. I believe it was Jung who said, it is what I do, not what I say, that makes me who I am. All that I do shows who I am. A good tree bears good fruits. And a bad tree, well, you know. External peace starts within each one, and so it is with gratitude. Let us not expect your spouse, your brother, your sister, your mother, your aunt, your crazy uncle to be the first one to do this. Do it ourselves. Be grateful. Begin thinking about St. Francis. If St. Francis were here, Would he do this? Would he be blessing the guy who cut me off? He would. Would he be blessing the boss that at 4:45, when I'm about to leave to come to the Spiritual Center, decides to shoot me 5 emails and says, can you do all this right now? Let's bless the boss. Instead of fear, this is interesting. Instead of fear of accepting it, let one be a spontaneous donor and become cured of all blemish whilst rehearsing generalized harmony. We really had to sit and really think about what she meant when she said this. For us, it means when someone wants to do something charitable for you, let them do it. Sometimes allowing somebody else to be charitable is a charity in and of itself, even if you're not necessarily needing that, but maybe they need to be that. Maybe they need to be that kind person because they need to help someone. It's going to help them to help you. So help them help you. Instead of being fearful. In the book, No Solar, they talk a lot about the human emotion of fear and that it's a huge impediment for our progress. You can read about it in the book. They have lectures about it in the spirit realm, how to stop your fear, how to get over it. It warrants us to think about that. She says the following: life without gratitude is sterile and void of existential meaning. So, this was the first of many workshops. We invite you to offer your feedback, to offer your comments, your questions, and we are sincerely grateful for this opportunity to you, to our viewers, to God, to our friends, to our enemies, to everyone for this opportunity. So I'm going to open up for 5 minutes. If you have any questions, if not, what we're going to do, we're not going to have the actual passes tonight. We're going to do a visualization and a prayer as well. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or we're going to roll out the prayer and the visualization? Alba. Yes.
Thank you, Kirsten. I feel
Thank
in
you.
college again, which is awesome. I love it, really. Thank you. Thank you for being the instrument of communicating Joanna's message about the unconscious, which is that hidden part of our iceberg personality, right? Can we say that in our unconscious remains or stays the memories of previous lives in a zip
Yes.
file?
Yes.
That's where they are.
Yes.
Even if it's something positive, negative,
Yes.
beautiful, horrible, whatever
Yes.
it is, that's, the files are there.
We would say it's at the level of the shadows and below, because that's where the unconscious is. But yes, and she says it's so much so that, for instance, someone could be in one life a genius pianist, but in the next life they're meant to work on something else. That part of them will remain dormant unless something happens to them that triggers that memory or triggers that tendency. They're just going to be an everyday Joe. She says that, like it or not, memories from our past or even this life, traumas or whatever we push down, they will bubble up. Little parts here and there. That's why sometimes we see people late in age, or spontaneously out of nothing, begin to change their career, or they all of a sudden display this talent that they've never had before. Or, for instance, people who for the first time, let's just give an example, encounter or see a black horse for the first time in their life for whatever reason and become terrified of it for no reason. That we can say it's something below, within their unconscious mind that they don't consciously remember, but unconsciously they know that they had some sort of trauma with a horse for whatever reason. And we see this more so with people that go through traumas. I know Alberto Almeida talks a lot about his patients that he does regression therapy with that have these really insane fears that are unexplained, that make no sense, people that are afraid of blackbirds or this or that, and they uncover it's because of a past life. And as a sidebar to that, we never encourage people to do past life regression because you're dabbling with something that nobody knows yet until you uncover it. So in his circumstance, he only does in extreme situations where people cannot function in day-to-day life. But yes, it lies, there is a part, we would say, within us that catalogs every single last thing we do. It's there. There's no hiding it, not from ourselves or God.
Thank you. So we can conclude that moving from the human state to the angelic one and beyond, we will, everything that is unconscious will become conscious. We will be fully conscious.
So that's an interesting question. So in the book, in several books of Andrea Louise, there's a bunch of cases. Also in the book Action and Reaction, I'll talk about the one Action and Reaction. There's a case of a young man who is well. He's moderately evolved. He's a good person. They say he's a good spirit. But he turns to the mentor and he says, okay, so I'm in the spirit realm. I've been here. I'm working. I'm in Nal Solar. I'm doing all the, not Nal Solar, in the place that they're at. I forget the name. Mansalpaz. And he says, well, how come I'm not remembering? I thought that when you die and you become, you evolve, you begin to remember. And the mentor says, not quite. You really have to really, truly, highly reach a high level of evolution spiritually to begin just to uncover. It just doesn't happen like that. And the mentor said in his circumstance, it wasn't yet necessary for him to know everything. That there is a certain level of preparation. And we would say for every case is a different case. It doesn't just become known to us. Like a lot of people have this notion that when I die, everything's going to become clear. It's not quite like that. No, there actually is a whole process that they describe in the spirit realm that these spirits have to go be seen by special therapists to do a special therapy. Even sometimes it's so deep, it's like crystallized, that they have to do a special spiritual surgery to remove some blockage there, to bring it to light, to work on it. So it's every case is a case, but yeah, it's there. Everything is there. It's within us. We just don't remember it. And we would say, if today I'm a pretty decent person, what's back there, way back there, probably not the best, because we go up. We don't go down or to the side. We simply go up. Myself personally, I don't really want to look back, but if you really want to know, at least to some extent, look at our tendencies, what we like towards, what we go towards. But thank you, Abba. That's an excellent question, comment. Anybody else? Antonia, please.
You're talking about consciousness and unconscious and shadows. How we explain, for example, family. Let's suppose a couple has 2 kids, 2 boys. One boy is exactly like his father, acts like his father, live like his father, and the other one is exactly like his mother. How does it explain where do we get something during the conception from the parents that even the way to live, to express, or?
It's a very good question. So I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. I'm going to answer from a spiritist perspective and psychological perspective, which kind of merges together anyhow. So in psychology, there's a belief of nature versus nurture. So there's this feud that some people subscribe to the nurture, which means that how we are, we're made that way. For instance, people that are really, really good, it's because they had great parents. And people that are really, really bad, it's because they had terrible parents. But then there's the idea of the nature, that we are that way. So in Spiritism, we believe it's a mixture of both. It's both nurture and nature. So Jung, as well as Joanna, says from the time that a woman becomes pregnant until the adult phase, the ego is being formed. That's why it's so important when we have children to be so proactive and in a positive way, be self-conscious in a positive way, not the negative self-conscious where you're always insecure. But be aware of what I'm doing as a parent. That's why Maria Montessori said that the education of children begins before the woman is pregnant. Because why? Because I, the parent, or we, the parents, the invisible parent that's here, we will affect the child. How I am, the child will pick up on those habits, good and the bad. For instance, I'll use a personal example. today and age, or today, I could say my daughter has the habit of drinking water because I have the habit of drinking water and reading. Since she was young, I love to read. And she would sit, or I'd lay her in my bed, I'd get a book, and I'd give her like something to just look at, even when she couldn't even read yet. That, in the human psyche, began to formulate a habit now that even she herself isn't even conscious of, she just does it. So when we are educating our children, we need to do those things. We need to teach them, okay, let's go wash our hands before we eat. So much so that it formulates a deep-seated habit, even deep down rooted in the unconscious, that as they grow older, they're going to be doing things that they're not even thinking about doing until one day they get older and say, I've become my mother or my father. So it's both. Now, there is the component of past life. There's great examples of that in Action Reaction. Stories of parents that, for instance, the father loves the son but hates the other son, but the other son is much more attached to the mother. And that has to do with past life, that those two spirits didn't have a great relationship with their current father in a previous life. In this life, they come together to repair those things. So we can say it's a mix of just affinity. Those spirits just are similar in nature. There are many people that grow up and have more affinity with their mother than they do with their father. Sometimes it's just the nature of the spirit, and sometimes it's because perhaps the father didn't nurture a relationship with that particular child because unconsciously he doesn't like the child. He himself may not even be aware of it, because a lot of times we don't want to say the words because we're going to feel like we're a bad person. But there are some people that we can say that don't like their one child, but like the other one. Some adamantly will say that, I don't like this child, I like this one, but their own kid. Life, reincarnation, and progress, these are all things along our trajectory. Does that answer your question? So it's a mix. It's a mix of past life, this life, nature, and nurture. So we will end here. We can continue our discussion if anybody would like to after here, but I'm going to ask Daniel to play the soft music for everyone just to put what's on their lap.